Thank you for joining us for the East Mediterranean Business Cultural Alliance's, EMBCA's 120th anniversary of the passing of a multicultural icon, Lafcadio Hearn. My name is Lou Katsos, EMBCA's president, and I will be moderating today's panel. Our distinguished panel includes Simon J. Bronner, Dean, College of General Studies and Distinguished Professor of Social Studies at the University of Wisconsin, author, poet, Nicholas Alexiou, Professor of Sociology and Director of the Hellenic American Project at Queens College, Associate Professor Dr. Oğuz Baykara of the Bogaziçi University Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Department of Translation Studies, and multimedia artist Agni Zotis. Lafcadio Hearn, whose anniversary actually of his passing was last Thursday, in September 26th of 1904, was born on the Hellenic island of Lefkada, and is a figure whose life and work epitomizes the multicultural experience. His unique blend of Irish, Hellenic, and later Japanese influences, along with his extensive studies and deep curiosity about different cultures, resulted in a rich legacy that transcends geographical and cultural boundaries. Hearn's early life was marked by a blend of cultures. His father, Charles Bush Hearn, was an Irish surgeon of the British Army, and his mother, Rosa Antonio Casamati, was Greek. This multicultural heritage exposed Hearn to diverse cultural narratives from an early age. However, his childhood was also tumultuous. His parents separated, and he was sent to live with his father's family in Ireland. This period of his life was characterized by a sense of displacement and alienation, themes that would later permeate his writings. At the age of 19, Hearn moved to the United States, where he began his career as a journalist and writer. He lived in Cincinnati and New Orleans, immersing himself in the local culture and developing a keen interest in African-American folklore and Creole culture. His work during the period included his collection of sketches. My apology, I keep getting this these notes. His work included, during this period, his collection of sketches, Gambo Zembes, Little Dictionary of Creole Proverbs, reflecting his deep appreciation for the rich tapestry of cultural traditions in America. Hearn's writings often focused on the lives of marginalized communities, showcasing his empathy and keen observational skill. Just one second. Costa, the only thing that appears on my screen is an L, and I don't know why. But if you can see what that's about.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's all good.
Excellent. Hearn's most significant cultural transformation came in 1890 when he moved to Japan, a country that would profoundly influence his life and work. He initially went to Japan to write a series of articles, but ended up staying for the rest of his life. In Japan, Hearn married Setsu Koizumi, a samurai's daughter, and adopted the Japanese name Koizumi Yakumo. This immersion into Japanese society allowed Hearn to experience its culture from an insider's perspective, and he became one of the foremost and first Western writers to present Japanese culture to the world with depth and sensitivity. Hearn's writings in Japan, such as Kwaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things, and Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan, are considered classics. He delved into Japanese folklore, ghost stories, and everyday life, capturing the essence of a culture that was at a time largely unknown to the Western world. His ability to blend his Western perspective with a deep respect and understanding of Japanese traditions made his work unique. Hearn's portrayal of Japan was not just an exotic, other but as a complex and rich civilization with its own values and aesthetics. Hearn's multicultural experiences shaped his worldview and literary voice. He is celebrated for his ability to navigate and articulate the complexities of different cultures, fostering greater understanding and appreciation among his readers. His life story, marked by constant movement and adaptation, is a testament to the enriched power of multiculturalism. Now I'd like to start introducing our panelists, who will make some short presentations, after which we will have an open panel discussion. Our first panelist is Professor Simon Bronner, the Dean and Distinguished Professor of the College of General Studies at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. He has also taught at Harvard University, Penn State University, Leiden University, and Osaka University in Japan. He is the author of Lafcadio Hearn's America and editor and author of 40 other books on folklore, literature, and cultural history. He is the recipient of the Lifetime Scholarly Achievement Award from the American Folklore Society. Welcome, Simon, and thank you for being with us today.
It's truly a pleasure, and I thank you for organizing this and keeping Lafcadio Hearn's memory alive. He had a lot to contribute. He perhaps was not as appreciated because he fell between the cracks of literary society and at the same time of cultural history and anthropology as well, because he was not an academic. He was a journalist. And for that matter, he also escaped some attention from journalism in addition, because he wrote essays rather than reported the news. Now, I'm wondering if I can show just briefly my PowerPoint. Okay, my theme, as should be no surprise from Lewis's introduction, is on Lafcadio Hearn's contribution to folklore studies and also the influence of folklore upon his own creative expression. My view, and perhaps for discussion across the many genres in which Lafcadio worked, was his struggling with the dilemma of being sensitive to tradition, and particularly ethnic tradition, with modernization, which was accelerating very quickly in the industrial cities in which he found himself, of New Orleans and Cincinnati, and particularly with his reporting on the World's Fair of 1884 in New Orleans, which was showcasing industrial and technological progress in the world. And yet I would argue that because of his background, as was mentioned, with Greece and Ireland, places that are very steeped in Old World tradition and mythology, that despite his embrace of modern subjects, he had a strong feeling for his own identity as a cultural person. Okay, so if you could continue, maybe I'll skip on who was Lafcadio Hearn, because I think Lewis gave a good introduction to that. This is a bit of a review, as you can see here, and his forays into folklore studies. Okay, you can. Now in Cincinnati, Cincinnati was an edge town, as was New Orleans, and particularly because it was on the southern border, it attracted many free blacks coming across the Kentucky border and staying there and mixing, although there were miscegenation laws there that got Lafcadio Hearn into trouble with an affair that he had in a boarding house with an African-American woman. Go ahead to the next one. So his themes in his writing were clearly on this idea of creolization, even before he went to New Orleans, the mixing of cultures, what that meant for the dominant cultures, and also how this related to the past and how whether it would survive into the future. At the time, folklore studies was in its incipient stage. The first folklore society in the world was in England, which was founded in 1877. And then the American Folklore Society wasn't founded until 1888. And he found himself intrigued by what was happening at the time. But what these scholars were looking at, many of them in the museum field, were survivals, natural specimens, with the idea that tradition would inevitably be displaced. It could not last. And this is a theme for our modern day as well, especially within the Hellenic cultural preservation and other preservation of traditions. He was attracted to the odd, the bizarre, and the lowly, perhaps not just because he was somehow psychologically strange, but because I think this fit into this idea that many of these cultures that he was attracted to that were rich in traditions were outliers. They were marginalized, whether that was African Americans, Italians, which he studied as well, in addition to Greeks and the Irish within dominant imperial cultures. Next. He was a beat reporter of the crime scene in Cincinnati. You would not think that this would be an occasion for anthropological or ethnographic studies, but often as part of his reporting on crimes within neighborhoods that many reporters did not go to, he gave background, he gave context on their cultural traditions, and this included Italian foodways, this included Jewish ritual practices, this included French customs in addition, and this became popular in the sense that many of the readers were interested in what was happening in these areas that they dare not enter. Go ahead to the next one. He was interested in language because of his own multilingual background. What was not mentioned also was that he also translated in French. He spent some time in France in addition, and he saw around him an emerging tradition, an American tradition, particularly in language. And this is a point where I would say the significance of his folklore studies, unlike the survivalists that I mentioned, is that he saw tradition in the everyday. He saw tradition as emerging, of new traditions continuing, and the gifts, in fact, that these cultures, many of them immigrant, brought to the dominant culture. Next. This especially came out in gumbo Zotis, and one of the reasons I call this gumbo folkloristics is that he saw mixtures. It became a metaphor in his study of Creole foodways for what was happening in America generally, although this was not the major narrative of the time. The major narrative was of Americanization, of white settlers taking over and eliminating Native American and indigenous cultures. But he saw in places like New Orleans a Creole type, which was rich, which was significant, and also relating to what was happening in the world. Next. His study of Chinese ghosts were not from the Chinese, although there was a Chinese influence in New Orleans, but it was his entree, if you will, into the study of narratives, of folk literature. And he was attracted to them because of their use of fantasy, but also the context of history and the idea that these legends were part of their everyday life. They weren't ancient myths, as perhaps he was taught about his Greek background and the ancient myths there. These were living legends, and something that he would continue when he was in Japan with even a deeper dive into ghost lore, where ghosts were also part of the ritual life of the Japanese. Next. There he found that Japan was modernizing quickly because the government made it a policy to modernize, and he thought something was lost on that. To our eyes today, the Japanese were, in fact, a tradition-centered culture. But what he saw among the Japanese was a very dramatic change, particularly with the Meiji administration at that time. Next. And he noted also the integration of life with folklore there, that it was not something that someone would find in an exotic form, but in everyday conversation. And this was hard for him to let go of. Next. And also entered into his literature. So, what is the lesson for today, and perhaps discussion about Lafcadio's impact 120 years later? That we realize that traditions have not been displaced. They still have a function. They are in need of preservation, of documentation. We need more Hearns to bring out the multifaceted aspect of folklore, not only on the streets, but also in our homes, and also the way that it can inspire creativity, inspire literature. And I should mention art as well, because another skill that Hearn also found was the influence of folklore on prints, block prints that he would create. And some of the reprints of his work have included these block prints that he created. So multifaceted in terms of culture, multifaceted in terms of his forms of expression. I hope that's a little seed of some discussion, but I would say that now he seems prescient also in folklore studies, where the academic study has looked increasingly now to ethnography, to the here and now, to the integration of folklore in modernity and looking at everyday life. Thank you.
Simon, thank you so much for that. And let me ask you a question, because a lot of the biographies that come out have him being married to the woman in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Is that sort of like I'm not going to say a myth, but was that they were never married? I know it was illegal at that particular time, post Civil War, for anyone who was so-called white to marry anyone who was black. Were they married or not really?
There is correspondence about a ceremony which was secret, but there's not documentation because whoever would have presided over that ceremony could not file, let's say, a marriage license in the clerk's court there.
The reason why I bring it up is because that was one of the issues that have had him have problems with the initial paper that he was working with, besides the fact that he was also, like, I'm not going to say anti-establishment or whatever, but a lot of people got ticked off at some of his articles that I think he was writing at the time. So both are correct.
Yeah, in that sense. And this was while he did not get centrally involved in politics. He certainly, through his writings, had to deal with the politics also in Japan because he was fired from his teaching job for what was anti-Western feelings at the time. So he certainly had brushes with politics, which comes out in his literature, although he was not outspoken in his political views.
Just one more thing before I introduce the next speaker, but he was also credited with helping, at least his writings, helping an African, a former slave who was taken, who was free and then taken back into slavery, and where she won reparations. Is that correct also?
Yes. While he didn't make that public, that again came out in later correspondence. And thank God he had a correspondence of an elite patron, if you will, who kept all his letters and then later published them. They're a rich record, and these days letter writing is a lost art, as you know. So I was very fortunate to be able to have access to all those letters, which have been published in different forms. We don't know if some of them were censored, and there were letters that did not appear in those volumes, but it's a very valuable resource for us as we look back to his personality and its impact on his prodigious output.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Professor Nicholas Alexiou. He was born in Volos, Greece, where he studied economics. He has taught in the Department of Sociology at Queen's College since 1990, and he has received the President's Award for Excellence in Teaching. His fields of interest are social and political sociology, ethnic studies, and research. He has established the first archive library museum for the Hellenes of New York, and he is the Director of Research of the Hellenic American Project at Queen's College. Also a contemporary poet, he is the author of 6 books of poetry, and many of his poems have been published in Hellenic and American journals and anthologies. He is a member of the Hellenic Authors Association and the president of the Hellenic American Writers Guild Association, and he is also one of our directors here at EMBCA. Welcome, Nico, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, thank you. It's a real honor to be among this distinguished panel, and I would like to mention, Lou, that this is a continuation of presenting various aspects regarding Lafcadio Hearn.
Yes, we must have had 4 or 5 different either panel discussions, whether it's on the internet or live, actually, and we started a few years ago, and I think it's taking off. I think you have to continue to do this. You have to continue to talk about Lafcadio around September. So thank you, Nico, for that.
Just a few hours ago, you had a great event in Greece, and I hope you let us know about this at some point later.
I will discuss it later on our general discussion, of course. Yeah,
that's very, very important. And last time we had a panel, I had focused on his American writings, and today, as a sociologist, it's very intriguing to me how an early sociologist like Herbert Spencer had such a great influence on Lafcadio Hearn. I'm reading a letter he sent to another person who had the name Crosby. This is Tokyo, August 1904. And he says, "Dear Mr. Crosby, a namesake of yours, a young lieutenant in the United States Army, first taught me about 20 years ago how to study Herbert Spencer. To that, Crosby, I shall always feel a very reverence of gratitude, and I shall always find myself inclined to seek the good opinion of any man bearing the name of Crosby." So you see, even he remembers he's in debt to the person who gave him a book by this sociologist, Spencer. Konstantine, let's start, and we skip the early things, more or less, since both Lou and Simon mentioned about his thing. But it is easy to see that he spent about 12 years in America, and rather another of the same period also in Japan. If we go to the next one, when he arrived in Japan on April 4th in 1890, in 1890 in Yokohama, and as we know, he went for a short time, but he stayed for the rest of his life. He went there on an assignment for Harper's Magazine. Then he moved away from the publication, and he started working as a teacher at the Izumo in northern Japan. So upon reaching Japan, Hearn was immediately captivated by the country. He already knew a few things before he went there while he was in America, and that he expressed his enthusiasm for Japan's custom, art, and culture to various letters. One of them is to a dear friend of him, that I love their gods, their customs, their dresses, the bird-like equivalent songs, the houses. He loved everything about Japan. In the next one, we'll see that as I mentioned before, in the Meiji period, let's see the political background that happened and the social changes that happened at that time when he arrived. The new regime that overthrew the previous one, the Kuhana Shogunate overthrow, had significant changes in the Japanese society. One of them was a coalition of samurai and imperial loyalists leading to the restoration, aiming to restore power to the emperor again and to modernize Japan. Another significant change that happened, it was to form a centralized government. It was a new mode of production, from feudalism to the early capitalist, culture, environment, and politics. So the feudal system was replaced by centralized bureaucratic state. Lords were stripped for their domains, and the prefectural system, the eparchia, as we call it, was implemented to streamline governance. Other changes in the next slide include constitutional developments, and Spencer, as a British sociologist, play also a role to the formation of the Constitution. So it was this debate between radical changes and conservatism all the time. But definitely the changes established a constitutional monarchy and created a bicameral legislature known as the Imperial Diet. Another important change was the rights movement, the popular rights movement. For the first time after many centuries, the freedom and popular rights movement emerged, advocate for civil liberties and national assembly. So you have the emergence of the self in a community-based society, inspired from Western liberal ideas, of course, and particularly of Spencer, the natural rights, individual freedoms. In the next slide, we see two additional major changes that happened in Japan upon his arrival, upon Hearn's arrival, because it was an opening to the Western political, legal, and educational systems. So we have this Westernization movement, along with the public administration, which was, emphatically to support the government and public discussion and participation. So overall, these transformations collectively aim to modernize Japan, the nation state capable of competing with Western powers. Of course, I don't want to leave out the pressure by Western powers, either in the form of colonialism or imperialism, but definitely it was the change of the system in Japan that had to be upgraded. So the rapid and comprehensive nature of these changes set the stage for Japan's emergence as a major world power later in the early 20th century. In the next one, we'll see now how Spencer, what is the role of a sociologist playing such a significant role? First of all, in his writings, Spencer talked about the liberal defense of natural rights. That was his liberal philosophy, particularly his defense of natural rights resonated with Japanese intellectuals and other political activists who were advocating for people's rights since the 1870s. Of course, Spencer is very much famous about his theory of evolution, and this is a historical misunderstanding. The very famous phrase, the survival of the fittest. Many people think that it was coined by Darwin, but it was not. It was it is an expression coined by or made famous by Herbert Spencer. So his concept of the evolution of societies from militant to industrial forms provided a framework for understanding social progress. And this idea was appealing to both proponents and opponents of the popular rights movement. So we see this constant debate between, the polarized parties, and we see that also in Hearn's philosophy and understanding of Japanese society. On one hand, he, let's say, for example, although he came from a very multicultural background, his mother was of mixed marriage in Cincinnati with an African-American woman, his relationship, or studying the Creole cultures in New Orleans, in Madagascar. So we see how different he approaches Spencer, who was clear about evolution, and he was against mixed marriages, etc. In the next slide, we'll see the influence of political activism, how Spencer's ideas were instrumental in shaping the discourse around political activism in Japan. We had a plethora of translated works that dominated the major debates in the Japanese society. And of course, for the first time, we have a critique of the status quo. For those defending the existing political order, Spencer analysis serves as a formidable abstraction that could be used to argue against the advocates of popular rights. So Spencer's ideas were employed in debates about the necessity of a constitutional government and the role of the state in society, influencing the political landscape and the arguments made by various factions within Japan. And now we proceed to see in the next one. We understand the part of Spencer's influence, very important in the engagement with Western political thought that shaped Japan's transition from the feudal society to modern nation during the Meiji era. So now let's go and see in the next one what is the relation between Spencer and Hearn. In many occasions in his letters, in this two-volume book by Elizabeth Bisland, The Life and Letters of Lafcadio Hearn, we have many references how he expresses his adoration about Spencer. And in other instances, he claims himself, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not anything else, but I am a Spencerian. Which is also the case for many American intellectuals, even Supreme Court judges. They identify themselves as Spencerian. So Spencer was not only very popular and important in Japan, but also in other parts of the world, especially here in America at that time. But Spencer's ideas helped or was the base for Hearn to approach and interpret Japanese culture and philosophy. In the next one, we'll see some of the issues that in my understanding about Spencer's influence on Hearn's. First of all, it was about Spencer's theories of social evolution, suggested that society developed through distinct stages, from militant, which is not only conflict and hierarchy, but also to industrial, marked by cooperation, economic interdependence. Later, another sociologist, Milderheim, he will talk about simple and complex division of labor, and that characterizes different societies as simple or advanced. And then the cohesion of society can be either mechanical or organic. That's why in many cases we see Hearn to be somehow questioning the idea of the concept of progress, what we understand as progress, and how Japan should keep much of its character and be more skeptical or more slow to absorb, to receive the Western values, ideas, and way of living. So in his writings, I believe Hearn expressed a keen interest in the cultural and social shifts occurring in Japan as it moved towards industrialization. He observed how traditional structures were being challenged and reformed, reflecting Spencer's ideas about societal development. Actually, that was the case all over the world after the Industrial Revolution. What happened to Western societies with the emergence of the Industrial Revolution that changed many societies all over the world, especially in Europe and later in America. In the next one, after social evolution, we see he's concerned about individual rights in society. Although because Spencer focused on individual rights and the role of the individual within broader social context, that influenced Hearn immensely. Hearn explored themes of personal freedom, the dynamics between the individual and collective, and the collective in Japanese culture. He examined how Japanese identity was shaped by both traditional values and the pressures, the new pressures, the acute pressures of modernization. This exploration is evident in Hearn's essays, where he discusses the nature of the Japanese society and the balance between individual expression and communal responsibilities. Lafcadio Hearn's reflections on these themes demonstrate how Spencer's emphasis on individual rights resonated with his own views on the importance of personal agency and the structure and the evolving social landscape of Japan. Another aspect that I found very interesting in the next slide is to see some of his essays or writings about Japan. The one in 1894, The Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan, where a collection of essays showcases Hearn's observations of various aspects of Japanese life and culture. And in these writings, he often draws on Spencerian themes, discussing social evolution and the relations between individuals and society. His insights into Japanese customs and practices are framed within the context of societal change, illustrating the influence of Spencer's theories. And we'll see some examples in the next one. One quote that I found interesting from this book, that the Japanese are in a state of transition, and the old ways are being replaced by new ideas and practices. This evolution is not merely a change of form, but a transformation of the very spirit of the people. This is a quotation from his book, where he recognizes Japan's societal evolution, in association with Spencer's concepts about societies and progress. The other book that was interesting was in 1904, Japan, an attempt at interpretation, where in this book Hearn delves deeper into the philosophical foundations of Japanese culture, and he discusses how Spencer's ideas about the evolution of social structures inform his understandings of Japan's cultural identity and historical development. He tries to make a synthesis of space and thought and his own observations, with his own unique way, of course. And we see a quotation from that book in the next one. The balance, right? The harmony that he all probably that was his Greek understanding about balancing and having an equilibrium between the new and the old. In this book about Japan, he writes that in the heart of the Japanese, there exists a profound respect for the individual. Yet this respect is harmonized with a deep sense of duty to the community. The individual is not lost in the collective. Rather, he finds his identity within it. A very important statement, especially for our days, especially for the new forms of authoritarian states in our days and the polarization we have in our societies 120 years later. In the next slide, we'll see another book, The Spirit of the Japanese Poetry in 1900s, which is early upon his arrival, where Hearn examines the aesthetic and the philosophical dimension of Japanese poetry, linking these broader themes of social evolution and individual expression. He explores how poetry reflects the cultural shifts occurring in Japan, drawing connections to special ideas about the development of societies and the role of the individual creativity. In this book, the quote from this book reads, we go to the next one, about poetry. Japanese poetry is a mirror of the soul of the nation, revealing the delicate balance between tradition and the new currents of thought that are reshaping our world. So it's a very important quote, I think, because here it's an emphasis of poetry as a reflection of societal evolution, aligning with special theories about the development of cultural forms in response to changing social conditions. So this is a new field also in sociology. New studies show, or they're trying to figure out the connection of cultural events, cultural changes. We have an artist among us. She probably can tell us more about that. How art is also related to the arts, either this is in painting or in poetry or in literature in general. So I hope we have a chance to discuss that later. And thank you very much for today's panel and for giving me this opportunity to.
Nico, thanks so much. Let me ask you a question. Has anyone written in depth about Hearn and Spencer? Has anyone written in depth?
I have one master's degree from Columbia University in 1927. So
1927.
This is the last one that I found that specifically talks about the relation between Spencer and Hearn. Yeah.
Can you just give us the title of that particular dissertation?
Yes, The Influence of Frederick Spencer upon Lafcadio Hearn, by Marion Gray Culver, October 3rd, 1927. I found it in the archives at Columbia University. She was a student there. Yeah.
All right, Nico, what we want from you is going forward, you have to put something together that goes, let's say, the next chapter of that particular dissertation. I think it'll be very interesting. Thank you, Nico, for that. Our next presenter is Professor Dr. Oğuz Baykara. And he wrote his first master's thesis at the Department of Linguistics at Bogaziçi University of Istanbul. He went to Japan in 1992 to specialize in Japanese language and literature. He studied his education at Kyoren University, and again, everybody, my apology in some of these pronunciations. He completed his doctoral thesis in 2004, focusing on Emperor Taisho period literature, writers Gonichiro Tanizaki and Ryonsuke Akutagawa. Thank you for correcting me. He returned to Turkey and worked as a faculty member of Bogaziçi University, Translation Studies Department for 15 years. Baykara, who has been a faculty member at Yeditepe University, teaches at Bogaziçi University's Agent Studies Master's Program and continues to serve as vice president of the Japan Study Association. He received the Diplomatic Mission Award from the Consul General in Japan, in Istanbul, in 2020 for his contributions to Japanese culture and literature. Professor Baykara has articles and books written in 3 different languages, such as English, Turkish, and Japanese, and many translations, mostly from Japanese. And some of his publications are Kappa, Rashomon and Other Stories, Shunkinsho, History of Japanese Literature, Basic Japanese Turkish Dictionary, The Tale of Genji, The Birth of Modern Japanese Literature, and Shiji Noaya, Taishu Literature, Portrait of Tanizaki. Oh, yeah. You're gonna have to finish this.
Tanizaki.
Listen, you made this complicated for me. I think it was a test.
I'm sorry.
No. I really appreciate all this. This is absolutely fantastic. And thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk in this panel. It's a great honor for me. Today, I'll be talking about the book of Lafcadio Hearn, which is called The Living God, and its Japanese adaptations like Inamura no Hi, that means the fire in the rice fields. The Living God was written by Lafcadio Hearn and its adaptations into Japanese. And I will also talk about my reflections on the book, on the translation I made into English and Turkish based on on one of these adaptations. Lafcadio Hearn, his Japanese name, Koizumi Yakumo, in Japan, wrote A Living God in English in 1896, based on the events in 1854 Nankai earthquake and subsequent tsunami. It teaches the importance of early evacuation and the vigilance after the earthquake, and as well as self-sacrificing spirit of the saving lives. Tsunezuo Nakai, a teacher, was deeply impressed by Hearn's work. He translated and restructured A Living God into a story called as Inamura no Hi, The Fire in the Rice Fields. The story is highly inspiring, regarded an educational material for the disaster preparedness. Lafcadio Hearn in this story contrasts Western and Japanese conceptions of God and introduces the story of Hamaguchi Goryo, 1820 and 1885, a village headman revered as a living god due to his extraordinary deeds in the village of Hira, the present-day Hirogawa, Wakayama district. The great tsunami disaster hit the village in 1854. And Lafcadio Hearn have written the story 42 years after this disaster. During the disaster, Goryo Hamaguchi set fire to the dried rice stalks in the fields, a very precious product of the time, allowing the villagers to reach the hills and escape without getting lost in the dark night. After the disaster, Hamaguchi Goryo had also spent a fortune to building a breakwater on the beach so that the villagers could live in peace without fear at home. He received his village by healing. He revived this village by healing the wounds caused by tsunami. The year 2020 marked the 200th anniversary of Goryo Hamaguchi's birth. On the 200th anniversary of this great man's birth, a Japanese friend of mine in 2020 called me and said that she wanted to perform the Japanese adaptation of this work on the stage. Therefore, she asked me to translate the Japanese text by Oşta Eiji into English and Turkish. She wanted to show these translations on the screen as subtitles in the background. She said that she wanted to do it for live broadcast with no audience. Before reading the Japanese source text, I downloaded Lafcadio Hearn's book, A Living God, from internet, and I read it, and it was impressive and fascinating, which I will be summarizing below. In the first chapter of the story, it describes the architecture and the atmosphere of the Shinto shrines, emphasizing their archaic wooden construction and mystical qualities. The author reflects on peculiar impression on Shinto shrines and which evokes feelings of weirdness and spiritual presence. He suggests that these shrines are more than just temples, they are ghost houses where the spirit of ancestors, heroes, and deities dwell. The chapter also explores the concept of divinity in Shinto, blending it with personal musings on what it would feel like to be a deity inhabiting one of these ancient shrines. The second chapter shifts focus to traditional village customs in Japan. These customs, though unwritten, govern social behavior, including ethics, work, and religious practices. The chapter also explains how the villages maintain peace and resolve disputes while highlighting the communal duty to help others in times of need. This includes religious obligations like invoking divine aid for the sick through collective prayer. The sense of honor and respect is instilled within the community, where personal disputes are highly regulated and harsh punishments exist for breaches of conduct, especially in romantic relations. The last chapter tells us the famous story of Hamaguchi Goryo, an elderly and respected village head who saves his village from a catastrophic tsunami when he notices the sea behaving strangely. He remembers the old tales of tsunami and quickly sets his rice fields on fire to alert villagers. Despite sacrificing his wealth, he manages to save the lives of 400 villagers. And after the disaster, the people honor him as God during building a shrine for him and worshiping him as Daimyojin, the god. So that is the title of the book, actually. Now I'll be talking about the adaptation of this. This inspired very many Japanese to rewrite and restructure the whole story. And although it was written, it was a local event written by a foreigner, and then the authors they found it really fascinating. They adapted it into their language. It wasn't done only once, but it was done more than once, 3 times, 4 times, or different times. The title of the Japanese text my friend asked me to translate is Inamura no Hi, The Burning of the Rice Fields. Author who rewrote the Lafcadio Hearn's work into Japanese is Oshita Eiji. The story details the heroic efforts of Goryo Hamaguchi, who saved his village from a devastating tsunami in a more theatrical and moving way. Here is a short summary. The story starts with a recount of a tsunami disaster in 1854. Goryo Hamaguchi, noticing warning signs such as receding water in wells, urged his villagers to evacuate to higher ground. Some villagers followed his advice, while others hesitated or dismissed it. Soon after, a massive tsunami struck the village. The village of Hiromura, known for its productions of soy sauce, was shaken by 2 earthquakes on November 5, 1854. Panic spread, as wells dried up an ominous sign of impending disaster. Despite the tremor the previous day, this earthquake was more severe, resulting in widespread destruction of homes. The earthquake caused chaos, with homes and structures crumbling. Goryeo quickly gathered the villagers and urged them to flee to Hirohachiman Shrine on the nearby hill for safety. It was at the top of the hill. Many fled, but some were caught by the relentless tsunami waves. The village was engulfed by the tsunami. Goryeo and other villages fled toward the hills. Many perished as 3 waves hit the village and people lost their loved ones. In the darkness, the survivors struggled to find their way to safety. As darkness enveloped the area, Goryeo devised a plan to help guide the villagers. He ordered the burning of rice stalks, which created a beacon of light for those still wandering in the darkness. This bold move saved many lives as villagers followed the flames to safety on higher grounds. After tsunami, Goryeo focused on feeding the survivors and borrowed rice from local temple and neighboring villages, distributed rice bowls to the hungry. His leadership helped alleviate the immediate starvation through food and supplies, though the food and supplies remained limited. Goryeo also organized the construction of new homes for those who had lost everything. He provided interest-free loans and tools to villagers and worked on improving the soil of the devastated fields. His generosity inspired many to stay in Hiromura village rather than leaving for safe areas. Goryeo recognized the need for long-term protection against tsunamis. He proposed the building of a breakwater
Have we lost Oğuz or he froze?
He froze. He's still online, but his video, maybe his connection is resetting.
Okay, let's see how it goes. All right. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah, he's back.
He's back. Okay, good.
Okay. Goryeo remained dedicated to the proposing only temporarily due to the planting of the harvest season. The breakwater, completed in 1858, stood as a testament to Goryeo's efforts to further protect the village. Goryeo encouraged the planting of black pine trees and wax trees along the embankment. These trees not only strengthened the structure but also provided economic benefits to the villagers. The final chapter emphasizes Goryeo's role in Japan's broader history. His actions were not only about protecting the village, but also about fostering a sense of community and altruism. His legacy, memorialized by the breakwater as the trees he had planted, continues to inspire the future generations. The story ends by noting how Goryeo's actions were immortalized in Lafcadio Hearn's short story. So it was him actually that made him known, also inspired to the other people, even the Japanese people, to write adaptations though. That's fascinating. So the story ends by noting Goryeo's actions are immortalized by Lafcadio Hearn's story, Living God, which praised Goryeo as a figure of divine morality. On the other hand, the adaptation of the Inomura Nahi is far more historical account of a natural disaster. It's a profound reflection on the power of moral leadership, the necessity of sacrifice, and the strength of community resilience. In a world of increasingly facing environmental crisis, Goryeo Hamaguchi's legacy offers timeless blueprint for the navigating disaster with compassion, foresight, and collective action. Through Lafcadio Hearn's work, the fire of Inamura became known outside of Japan as well. In the early 1990s, a version of the story titled Burning of the Rice Field was used as a supplementary reading material in elementary schools in Colorado in the United States of America. So see how it's spread all over the world. Thank you very much for listening.
Oğuz, thank you for that. A good friend of mine who's Japanese, obviously can pronounce the words better than I can. But he has said to me that in many cases, young people in Japan today, when they want to learn about a different time period, older Japan, that many of them go into the Japanese translations of Lafcadio Hearn's work on Japan, in Japan, to actually know something about their own culture.
Exactly. It's very true, actually.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Very true.
So your story basically parallels that, because there was obviously a Japanese version, but when Lafcadio wrote about it, he wrote about it in such a fashion that it actually changed the thought process of the Japanese people themselves, and that became the standard thought process with that particular tale that you told us. Am I wrong on that?
Exactly. It's exactly the same. They do really study. They're so fascinated. I lived in Japan for a long time, and then I could see almost every other year the pictures that he had taken of Japan, also the motion pictures that was not really very well known at that time. I could see the motion pictures that he produced in 1900s and so on, and in color. It cost him a lot of money, but he did it. You see, he invested a lot of money in it.
Let me ask you another question. In Japan, do the Japanese people believe that he's Japanese? Because many people, when they hear his Japanese name, they think he's Japanese. Am I wrong on that or no?
He's got. You see, you say Lafcadio Hearn. Of course, that's his real name. But Koizumi Yakumo is more familiar to the Japanese. It will ring a bell a lot more quicker to them. So to them, it's like he is Japanese, I think.
If I could jump in, part of that reason, at least when I was there, is that his folk stories are a basic part of elementary school reading, that his work also came into a lot of children's books that people would show me, and I would talk about Hearn, but it lit a light, so to speak, to say, oh yeah, I read that story in elementary school.
So he's had a tremendous impact, both of you, Simon and Oğuz. He's had a tremendous impact, I would imagine, within Japanese culture itself.
Yes.
Yeah, there's also the irony, which Oğuz points out, that at least the people I talked to when I was in Osaka thought of him as collecting authentic Japanese folklore, that they didn't associate him with being an outsider, because the way it was presented, at least in elementary school, these are our stories, whether or not they were actually interpreted by Hearn, the Greek American Irish writer.
It's really amazing. Thank you so much, Oğuz, for that presentation. It's fascinating, quite frankly, what an effect he has had on Japanese history and literature.
Exactly. It was rewritten, you see, and it inspired a lot of things. As Professor Simon said, some of his books, particularly this adaptation, was sort of a book in the curriculum that was taught between 1937 and 47 as a sort of a way of preparation for the disaster. You see, it won a competition. The adaptation won a competition, and it was taught actually as a part of the curriculum in primary school in Japan.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Agni Zotis. She's an internationally recognized artist for her light-sensitive paintings which transform under different lighting conditions. Her work explores the relationship between microcosm and macrocosm, organizing chaos into color, form, and energy. Her paintings made with pigments, crystal quartz, gold flakes, gold leaf, and ground sterling silver capture the interplay of light and knowledge. Her work is exhibited globally and held in public and private collections worldwide, and I have to say, including my own, So Agni Zotis has recently created and exhibited original art based on and inspired by, let's say, Lafcadio Hearn's writings, Japanese haiku masters on fireflies, what they call hotaru, and the points of light symbolized by the burning of Smyrna and the Tokimaru. Inspired by her research and artistic vision, she created a series of paintings which she called the Fireflies series, rooted in Lafcadio Hearn's love and work relating to haiku, and what was discussed earlier in terms of his interest in poetry, in the exploration of the symbolic significance of fireflies in both Japanese and Hellenic traditions, and portraying fireflies as metaphors for fleeting beauty and the passage of time, embodying the essence of wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection and transience. The exhibition that we're talking about was presented this past Thursday, which was actually on the anniversary, 120th anniversary to the day of Lafcadio Hearn's passing in September 26th of 1904, and it was a fantastic event here. I'm currently in Athens. It was a fantastic event that included the Japanese ambassador to the Hellenic Republic, and also there was 3 former Hellenic ambassadors to Japan, as well as the Irish ambassador, as well as people from the American embassy. And that represents actually Hearn's life. When you think about Greece, you think about Ireland, you think about the United States, you think about Japan. So it was very interesting. Agni, thank you for being with us today. And please discuss a little bit about your paintings. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I come from a completely different place than you guys do, which is quite fascinating. And I'm very interested in Hearn and his character, as I find him fascinating and modern Odyssey kind of fella. And somehow I saw similarities within my own life of being born in one place, grown in another, living in another. And this merge of East and West that have been interested in my path and in my life. He's with from Greece, Ireland, America, Japan. I'm from Australia, New York, Greece, India. So I really love his complex character and the way and his sensitivity and poetic expressions that he brings to the table. And Ilya called me up and asked me to participate in this exhibition if I would be interested to create a body of work. And these were the elements that I picked up on, who he is and the fact that he supports the underdogs, and he's interested in the marginal and this weird kind of things that others are not. And he's interested in food and, dating a Black American lady and marrying into a Japanese family and all these wonderful things that are really fascinating to me for a character. So I'll read a couple of passages that really influenced me. And these are similarities, again, that I'm finding because of my use of material and my subjects and the way I paint, that I deal with the impermanence and the ethereal of existence. So Lafcadio, being deeply influenced by the Japanese culture, often describes fireflies with a poetic sensitivity in his works. His writings reflect an appreciation for the fleeting beauty and ethereal nature of these creatures, often using them to invoke the culture, the aesthetics of the culture. It's interesting because you guys came from so many different angles. And here in ghostly Japan, Hearn writes, in Japanese life, the firefly is a symbol of the ghostly and the ephemeral. It's faint and luminous, its strange wandering flight, its sudden vanishing seems to suggest the shadowy and the supernatural. Now, these are like this gentleness of being that we're here for a minute and in the consciousness, you know, lighting up and then being gone. From the Quajan stories and studies of strange things, the whole night was warm and still and blue. There was a perfume of lotuses and lilies and water grasses, and there were millions of fireflies dancing over the river and among the reeds, like sparks of gold. So these really fueled my imagination to create a body of work. So, Costa, I'm gonna read. So I created these 9 paintings, and I took these kind of elements of his writings, and I'm gonna start from the top, and some of them are direct quotes from Lafcadio's books. From top left, ethereal beauty, in the middle is the firefly, flowers of flame. And underneath, I went into the haikus, really influenced by Lafcadio Hearn and his love for it, of course, and use of language. And this is the haiku. Bright moon, no flowers, no grass, just a field of fireflies. And this is written in 17, I'm not exactly sure, but the master that wrote this lived from the 1716 to 1780. And I find it fascinating. The next one is fireflies beyond the darkness along in the window. The next one, fireflies are flying. I too light a light lantern. Firefly hunting, watching the sea as night goes on. Fireflies flying aimlessly through the darkness. Firefly light, the invisible riverside, dark waters. So Costa, can you go to the next slide, please? So my work transforms with light. And although these are, because the opening was the other day and I just didn't have the chance maybe to get better slides, but my work transforms with light, and the light sensitive, and the way I use light is as knowledge. So we could perceive a reality through the way we use our knowledge, obviously. And these are things that I really love about Lefkada and his sensitivity to life.
I think Agni, you also told me that you were inspired by the fact that he wrote a piece on insects. He had this fascination with insects, and Hellenic poetry. It's kind of crazy. I mean, when you think about it,
Yes, he did.
all the stuff that he does is like so very interesting.
Well, it's a character that really bridges, right, cultures. And this is something that I adore about him. And I was thinking when I was making these paintings in particular, this bridge of cultures and honoring the ancient and the new to create this identity without being lost, finding oneself in it by recreating ourselves. And I think we are doing that constantly. And that's art to me. In its purest form. It's like, how do you define the moment, but also stand in mastery, in the old that has come before us, but create something new in the now?
Yeah, I'm totally fascinated with this particular person. We'll open it up now to a general discussion. And by the way, anybody can ask any question of anybody else. But let me ask the first question of Simon, and anyone can respond to it. Simon, let me ask you a question. Lafcadio Hearn in America, for the most part, is known basically more, I would assume, in New Orleans than anywhere else. Why isn't Lafcadio Hearn more well known in America when, in fact, in many cases, he is credited with introducing Japan to the West? Why isn't Lafcadio Hearn a bigger name?
Well, tried to say that before, and that I think he didn't fit well into any of the traditional academic categories. He was not an extensive novelist, and what he really wrote were novellas, and they were primarily in Japan. He wrote newspaper articles, but that were literary. So later on, there was a category of journalistic literature that arose, but of course the primary categories are going to be in poetry and literature. And at the same time, he wasn't the academic folklorist either. So he really worked at the margins that I think made his work very interesting there. Now, what helped his career was that there was a literary critic by the name of Malcolm Cowley, who, after World War II, looked at American literature in a new light rather than strictly by European standards of the romantic novel. He wanted to ask, who were those writers who really captured American life? And then Lafcadio Hearn was somebody who he gave a shout out to, who needed more attention because he looked at the underside of American life. He looked at the people who were overlooked. He looked at the vernacular, if you will. And that's a trend that has continued to the present, but still, I would tell you, in English departments as a dean, there's still the bias of the famous novelist or the famous poet as we look at that now. I think he was culturally significant, which is why I looked at him, and particularly as we're getting away from nationalistic categories also and looking more at transnational writers. And he was very early on, or some may argue the epitome, the exemplary transnational artist.
Yeah. Professor Bronner, do you think that Hearn wrote from a point of view that European literature or even American literature were more superior than the Japanese literature?
Well, clearly, I mean, he did write textbooks on literature, and he celebrated the European classical tradition, and that came out of his lectures as well at the university. But what he gained an appreciation from, that he ironically tried to pass along to the Japanese themselves, is that their oral tradition was artistic. I mean, there was a sense that some of that was taken for granted, although Oğuz has worked with the tale of Genji, and there is an epic tradition which is very highly revered, but at least in my time, Oğuz can comment more. It was almost seen as a work of history rather than a work of art. And that's where I think he was
Because
somewhat of a mediator. But I will say to Lewis's point, we still have work on recognizing what he did in America, because at least in my experience, and Oğuz can confirm this as well, he's much better known as a literary artist in Japan than he is in the United States. I would mention him and my work on him, and he would be someone who would be seen in what I think sadly is called minor genres. Although I think there are ways to look at it, and that he was also an ethnographic writer who revealed the inner life, which is a part of the humanities that we strive for.
No, I'm saying that because reading his lectures or some of his students' letters, he wasn't very supportive or encouraging, actually, for the Japanese students to pursue careers in literature, because, as we said before, it was a moment of fundamental transition in the Japanese society, and he wanted people to, focus on that more than pursuing a career in literature.
Well, I'll defer to Oğuz's opinion.
Yeah,
My opinion is that some of that was a problem of translation. He didn't read the Japanese classical texts, but he, through his wife and through his contacts, he did have a lot of exposure to the oral tradition and the storytelling, the narratives that he gained a great respect for.
By the way, everybody, just turn on our sound, because right now we're in an open discussion. So don't negate your ability to speak if you can, or both of you are good. Thank you. Oğuz, any thought
I have
process?
a concert. Sorry, I have a concert going on outside my window.
Okay, don't worry, we can't hear it right now. Oğuz, any
Oh,
thoughts?
good.
Yeah,
Oğuz,
well,
any thoughts on what Simon said?
well, he was more interested in the oral tradition, and then he picked up most of these probably through his wife, who was the daughter of a samurai, and she might have learned some English probably, but then he was not considered as a scholar, and by the time he was there, the history of Japanese literature was written, and then he was not one of the translators. Well, he did not attempt to translate some of the works into English, but he was just living there. He was a journalist, but he was a very, very, very keen observer in oral tradition. Therefore, the things that he wrote was written in English, and it was directed. It was directed towards the English-speaking people at that time. Therefore, none of the Japanese authors who were contemporary made a reference to him. For instance, Lafcadio Hearn wrote this. Later on, the people who were studying culture, or sociology of the country, or the oral traditions of the country, then they may have made a reference to it.
Well, I regard him just, again, I'm not you guys are the experts on Lafcadio Hearn, but I've got to tell you, in terms of the way I look at it, it's not so much literary or, what a genius of translation or whatever, or scholarly or whatever, but his ability to go into particular areas ethnographically, and basically document some things are more than amazing. In other words, some of his writings, I guess, in terms of these communities, as Agni mentioned, what she loved, the fact that he went into marginalized communities and discussed things that nobody really wrote about, because either people were afraid to go to these communities, or
certain things that he learned, they learned from him. He noticed it, and he told it to the Japanese people.
Yeah.
Well, exactly right. Even on in terms of the post-Civil War writings that he did in the African communities, African American communities, are kind of unique. Am I wrong on that, Simon, or no?
They were very early on. Yes, he's considered the first person to look at African American spirituals.
Yeah.
For example, he mentioned those folk songs, those non-religious folk songs that he heard in bars. I think the exemplary cases, and maybe that set the stage, he was willing to take risks. He was visually impaired, and yet he climbed to the top of a steeple in Cincinnati to talk about what the bird's eye view was, and waxed poetic about that as news, as a newspaper article. How crazy is that? But now,
Well, not only that, didn't he in let's say New Orleans write about voodoo type things and
Yeah.
all types of subjects that I would imagine would be fascinating to people today if they knew about him and his writings. If he became more well known. Yes, he was a newspaper reporter. Yes, he wasn't some great literary genius or what have you. But I would imagine that his writings, if the public knew more about his writings, they would be more than fascinated. I believe in America. I understand Japan, but in America, I believe that he hasn't reached that level, at least in terms of ethnographic documentation.
I agree.
And, yeah, we do. But in
I agree,
Japan,
but I mean, he set the stage for later celebrated writers like Truman Capote and Tom Wolfe, who really were journalistic literary artists.
Right.
yeah, but they got the fame and he didn't. In other words,
No.
we don't know too much
No.
about him. We don't know too much about Lafcadio Hearn. From what I gather, they say that the places that know him the best are Japan, obviously, but also New Orleans. Okay, but again, I'm not so sure how well known he is in New Orleans. What's the thought process on that?
Well, I spoke at the Louisiana Museum and about Hearn, and I didn't know who would show up, who would know him, and there was a very good turnout. So I think he's known particularly among those who are devoted to New Orleans culture as somebody who wrote early, particularly because of his cookbook, but they may not have known a lot of his essays and what he did there. His cookbook and his actually he did a proverb book still are reprinted and still circulate.
We didn't talk about, and I'm not sure who knows anything about this, but his work relating to in the West Indies, because I think there were some well-known things that he wrote also in the West Indies. Am I wrong on that, or?
No, you're absolutely right. I was not in the West Indies, so I can't comment on his reception there, but I think that's another case where it fell between the cracks in that it's not exactly a nationalistic literature. It's more generally, he wrote again about storms. He was very fascinated by the whole nature of disaster and how that upsets the balance of life.
Does anybody know? And Agni's work, I guess he was fascinated with the insect aspect, and I guess in this case the fireflies, which came over, I got to be honest with you, very well, because when the Japanese representatives were there, they were completely fascinated by someone putting art together on fireflies, because culturally, fireflies, I think, were a big deal to them. Oğuz, you were in Japan for a number of years. Are the fireflies something that is Japanese in nature, where they go out and picnic and see fireflies, or how does it work? Can you hear me, Oğuz?
Well, they have festivals.
They do. Is Oğuz frozen? I
No,
think
I'm not. I'm not frozen. No,
I'm
I was
sorry.
just listening. I was thinking actually. I'm just looking at the one of the books in my library. It is Makura no Soshi. Makura no Soshi is the pillow book. It's translated as the pillow book of Seisho Nagon. It is from the 10th century. The at the very beginning, they've got a chapter. It is Haru wa Akebono. That if you ask me what is best, it's the springtime. It starts like this, and then this is really very poetically written in Japanese, in the 10th century Japanese. And then they do mention, about the hotaru in the summer, when describing summer, for instance, or the spring, I can't remember it exactly. They mention definitely of hotaru, the fireflies, I don't care about the darkness, but then we have the hotaru, that lights, that illuminates the night, it says in the poem, you see. So hotaru has been always a fascinating insect for the Japanese, that pops up in haiku, in the prose, poetic prose, very, very often. And it was always like that until the 20th century. You see it in various different poems.
So in the 20th century, so this was sort of like a historical thing with the Japanese, but in the 20th
Yes.
century, it started to shift a little bit, or what's your thought on that?
Well, to my mind, the concerns of the people changed. They did not look at nature as much as they did before. They had the industry, and they had their job, and they had their development of their country, and therefore they spent less time. See, there is less poetry written in Japan, whereas they had almost ministries before, for the poetry, and the people who did not know poetry, who could not compose poetry, were not even employed, in the 10th century. So
Let me ask you,
a very important part of the culture.
Let me just interject too, another interpretation, which I do have in my article too, in that part of his attention to detail was because of his visual impairment, because there were stories and there's correspondence about how he was an ethnographer if he was visually impaired. And he would talk about needing to be very close to his subjects that made some people very uncomfortable. And he also in his reading, and so he would be seeing insects as part of his reality, so he related to them. And plus there's a part about his protruding eye. He had an eye issue that protruded, and so he related to insects because of their appearance, their disfigured appearance.
Oh, you think there was a linkage? You think there was a linkage between that? I find that fascinating. You also showed him with a picture, I think, with a hat on, okay, and part of the hat, I would imagine, would be slanted in a certain way,
Yes.
so you wouldn't see his eye, I would imagine, right?
He was very self-conscious about his protruding eye. He thought he was disfigured.
Because one of the things that Agni mentioned to me is she's never seen him in a particular pose. She always sees him pose, because she's an artist. She always sees him pose in a particular way, so an aspect of his face would not show. That is correct. Let me ask a question that has been on my mind, relating again to how when he was in Japan, all his writings, from what I imagine, I could be totally wrong, they really were read a lot in the West relating to Japan, because many people didn't know about Japan, and his writings were very popular within the West. One would imagine that a lot of this would appear. Was there, and again, this may be a sensitive issue, but I'll ask it anyway because it's in my mind and I have to ask these type of questions because I have a question myself. Did the militarization of Japan during the early 20th century and into World War II affect how Lafcadio Hearn was regarded, and did that in fact create a situation where he was not studied as much? I don't know if everybody has
well, studied by whom? You mean in the United States?
In the West, in other words, where they didn't want to, to think about him as writings of Japan and all the rest of that. was there a period like that that in fact got people to just, forget about him or want to forget about him? Because he wrote about a different type of Japan, okay? Different type of.
But I think that increased the interest in him. The trouble was that his editors at Harper's wanted news. They wanted him to cover more of the politics in the military. And he
Oh, I
wrote
see.
these
And
creative essays.
and he didn't
Actually,
basically.
he was let go and needed to find other means, and so he felt stranded. He couldn't get back to the United States.
Oh, so you're saying that was part of the reason why he was let go, that in fact he didn't go into those aspects that they were interested in, that would sell papers or magazines or whatever. That's very interesting.
But he found other outlets that would allow more of his creative kinds of insights there, and that's when he started producing books that did have an audience through those publishers. But originally, he went to Japan because he was on assignment from
Yes.
Harper's Weekly. I mean, it was a weekly. It was a news weekly.
It's pretty crazy. How many years was he sort of like a professor, lecturer, or whatever? Do we know? Oğuz, do you know?
I don't know, really. I don't know.
And let me ask you a question. When he
Yeah,
was,
I think it was about 5 years because he arrived in 1895 or so. He started getting more involved in lectures, but then with the war in 1905 with more anti-Western feelings, that's in the turn of the century period.
when he was lecturing, was he lecturing in English? Of course.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I mean, he spoke a kind of pidgin Japanese from what we understand there, but he was not. He never became fluent. Would you agree with that, Oğuz?
I think so. Yes, you're right. Mhm.
and
I don't
when
think he
yeah,
could speak it very well. Mhm.
and was he a professor or a lecturer of English literature, or what
Yeah.
did he actually teach?
Yeah, Western literature.
And
And he produced a book, Lectures in European Literature.
yes, he did. Did he also do translations when he was in America? Was he a translator of some French works, or do I have him incorrect?
He did do some translation because he needed some income. He was a transcriber and occasionally a translator as well. Because in those days, before there's word processing, people would be hired to actually transcribe works that would then be published.
The work. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Oğuz, please. Oğuz, please.
From his letters and many occasions and in some of his work, he is evident the love he had about Greece or Greek literature, ancient Greek literature. Even the book on incest is inspired by the Greek traditions and the Roman traditions about incest. How come he never traveled back to Greece? It was the trauma, as you mentioned, the divorce of his parents. How come he never traveled back to Greece?
He scraped by. He was never a man of means, and he only was able to go to Japan because it was paid for by the newspaper. I think if he had an assignment back in Europe, he probably would have taken it, but he went where he could make an income, and it was always minimal.
Well, the other thing is, I think he was a person who just moved on because his mother, to a certain degree, abandoned him. I'm not going to say she abandoned him, but right after they got, I don't know if it wasn't a divorce, but there was never a marriage. I think because she was illiterate, couldn't sign her name, and her husband basically said that they were never legally married. Am I wrong on that?
He did have it annulled.
He did have it annulled, yeah.
But I'm not a lawyer to get into what the details were there, but yes, he did.
And my understanding is his mother left quickly, and then she got married to somebody who was from the Ionian Islands, and he was a governor of one of the islands or something. So there was no contact, Nick, Nico. There was no contact between the mother and her son, and he also had a brother. He also had a brother, from my understanding, who even went to the United States, and they never met up. I think that's correct also.
Yeah.
So the interesting part is that I think Lafcadio Hearn found his home in Japan. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure that he felt very comfortable in the different societies he lived in, except when he went to Japan, where he, I guess, became comfortable, and he found his family. He found his family in Japan. I don't know if that's true, but that's the way it looks to me.
Well, he also writes of his affinity to the South because he also had a thing about the cold. Not that Cincinnati is that cold, but apparently his experience in France and in Ireland, he did not like the climate there. And he would talk about, again, his very poetic ways of describing things, of being like a lizard moving toward the sun. And he thought he found that in New Orleans, although he also wrote about floods and hurricanes that were disturbing there as well.
Was he a certain degree like a metamorphosis type character, like a Kafka character, or does anybody have any thoughts on that? Excuse me. It just came to my mind when I was thinking about insects. He was different, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
Anybody?
Seems like a character that doesn't belong anywhere but everywhere, that he could infiltrate and adapt and explore. But at the same time, he doesn't belong anywhere. And I think that's what I really love about him. That
He was the ultimate outsider, but I think he used that to his advantage because as a journalist, he would act ignorant. So tell me about what life is like. He took nothing for granted. I mean, he was never comfortable in Ireland. When he was in France, he had problems as well, and as Lewis described in Greece as well. So, and even in Japan, now it's true that he became Japanese, but he was still the outsider there, and especially that hit home when he was fired from his position because he was a Westerner.
Yeah, but what was interesting to me when he died, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, when he died, the Japanese came out, is what I heard. You know, the Japanese came out, and Western people who were in Japan at the time really did not want to go to his funeral, that he had actually a lot of people at his funeral. I believe that he became, I could be wrong, a Buddhist, and he had basically the respect of the Japanese, but not of the people of the West in Japan itself at the time. I don't know what caused that. Maybe, again, it's his character. I'm not sure. But,
well, he also wrote some things that could be construed as anti-Western, even though he was fired from his position because he had things to say about European imperialism and capitalism and industrialization that he thought was bad for our lives. I mean, one indication of the respect that the Japanese had is that after his death, his household in Matsue was turned into a museum, and it continued even during World War II. There was that shrine that was established before World War II.
Very good. We're going to wrap it up. So if we can, one by one, just some final thoughts, ideas, concepts, whatever you want to talk about. We'll start with Simon. Simon, any thoughts, final thoughts?
Well, all I would say is I appreciate this opportunity to connect with everyone. And it tells us that while a lot of his stuff is out there and there's been good research in these different countries, we still have a long way to go in fully absorbing what the impact and what the context is for a life of creativity.
Thank you, Simon. Nicholas? Your thoughts?
Well, it was very interesting to see, as a sociologist, to see how sociological theories and ideas can be somehow be appreciated by societies. And since Spencer's influence in Japan and elsewhere, but also to see how artists, because artists, they don't live in a vacuum, they live within societies. But Hearn, as an artist, as a person of literature, realized that, and he combined sociological research and theory with his creative work, and this is very interesting to me. And also to realize that it is a basic sociological aspect to have empathy. And because he was marginalized, he was all those things. He had this empathy and be open to new things, to examine, to study. And this is something that makes him, for me, a real social scientist besides being an artist. This is the real thing for doing social research, having empathy and put yourself to somebody else's position and bring it out. Sociology, after all, is an attempt to understand and also to shed light, as Agni said, right? The light as knowledge, and this is important.
Thank you so much, Nico. Oğuz, some final thoughts for the evening?
Yes. I find it really fascinating. The Japanese people call him Koizumi Yakumo. They seem to be more familiar with this name than Lafcadio Hearn, at least the literary figures that I know around me. And what I also find very, very interesting is one of the authors in Japan, let's say Akutagawa or Tanizaki, they see a Western author, and then they might want to sort of adapt him, or they might want to sort of copy him or restructure in a different way one of his works. They have inspiration from the West, whereas this man was living in Japan. This man was not talking about anything about Western, and he was talking about a disaster that happened in that own country. And then yet he gives inspiration to the local people who suffered from the same disaster. I find it really fascinating. And then this shows also the power of literature. We've got quite a lot of things to learn, even from the foreigners, within our own country, where it was true for Japan, for instance. They took the Living God and then they make adaptations in the last 150 years. Probably there are about 50 of them, see, and that is fascinating. And then they convert his house and where he lived into a museum, even during the war,
Right.
That's fascinating that Japan really recognizes him as a sort of scholar, as a literary figure, a very important person that they have to be thankful, who wrote for Japan for the improvement of world peace, So he's got a great name in Japan, I think.
I think so. I think also about 5 years ago, this is the 120th anniversary, but on the 115th anniversary, I did go to Japan because a friend of mine was erecting a monument to Lafcadio Hearn in Tokyo at Lafcadio Hearn Park. There's a park in Tokyo which is named after him, and the event was absolutely amazing because there was all types of Japanese dignitaries, mayors of the city, etc. Different ambassadors who came there for the 150th anniversary to see the monument that was erected, or at least it was commissioned by a friend called Masaki Noda. And Masaki Noda actually put a statue, in Tokyo that particular day. But he also was asked to put a statue in Lefkada itself. and has done that in the past. There's a statue also by Masaki in Athens. Actually, here in Athens, there's a statue by him. So it's very fascinating to me that he is honored by the Japanese and not as much honored by. Listen, he was born in Greece. All of a sudden, the Greeks discovered him in a very short time ago. Okay, when he became popular, I guess everywhere else, all of a sudden he becomes popular here. But he's also popular in Ireland. The Irish, who quite frankly didn't care for, I guess, where he was. And from what I gathered, he was supposed to, when his aunt died, he was supposed to inherit something, but he got screwed in that area. And meanwhile, in Ireland, they have a park. They have a park for Lafcadio Hearn. So he's an interesting individual. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, I believe his house is a museum now.
Yes.
Where he lived in
the Japanese house, yeah. Matsue.
No. But I think there's a place where he lived in New Orleans that's also. Am I wrong? Is there a museum? Yeah, his house in New Orleans, I think, is like a museum also. So with these type of forums, I think that, and we have to continue them. By the way, we can't stop because I think we have to elevate Lafcadio Hearn. And Agni, your final thoughts and the art world, as Nico stated, the art world can maybe breathe life into Lafcadio also. So we want your paintings to appear in museums so we can discuss Lafcadio Hearn relating to the fireflies. Agni, your final thoughts tonight?
I think he's a very important and complex and really beautiful character. And because he integrates in all these different cultures with sensitivity. And I think that's very much needed at this present day in our history, where we are becoming much more fearful and ready to look at the other in a different light because they look different or appear different. I would like more, including myself, like you guys are all scholars. I'm not in this. It's just like reading these incredible little pieces of him that move me deeply. I would like some of his writings to enter into schools, just like great writers. And because he's done amazing stuff, post-slavery, I mean, real important, even American history that people should know about, including myself, and on a bigger level that I think it'll be great for all of us to be more interested in cultures and explore them.
Thank you so much, Agni, and thank you to the panelists for this fascinating discussion, which we're going to continue because we can't stop. We have to continue to discuss the various aspects of Lafcadio and introduce them to more and more people. And I think as more and more people start to learn about him, I think Agni is correct. Okay, the fact that people right now are having real cultural problems with each other, and I think Lafcadio showed the way of interest in other cultures. To sit there, to learn from them, to write about them, and to be a part of them. And I think we all have to share that commonality in what we called here the multicultural icon, Lafcadio Hearn. Thank you all again, panelists, for being with us. Fascinating discussion. And thank you to the audience for listening to us tonight. Good evening, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.